Hi, this is Jim Janessi. I'm going to give you a short discussion about the ethical frameworks and how to reconcile the outcomes. In order to do this, I'm going to use a graphic that looks like this. Now, pardon me while I move the cursor around because in my experience, YouTube kind of messes up on still images if there isn't some movement. Here are your 5 ethical frameworks, beginning with act utilitarianism, rule utilitarianism, Kant and the rights concept, justice and fairness, and the social contract. In a way, I've pictured this hierarchy as building up from the bottom. That isn't entirely historically accurate because the social contract, of course, originates with Socrates a long time ago in ancient times. But for our purposes, let's consider act utilitarianism, a development of the Enlightenment. At this point, Jeremy Bentham sought to justify actions that did more good than bad. Without much regard for who was involved, it just seemed that if something created more good than ill, it was judged to be ethical. That presented some problems because it required a lot of calculation and a lot of determination of things that maybe couldn't be quantified very well. John Stuart Mill later changed things and came up with rule utilitarianism, so that in order to judge if something is ethical, you make a rule about it, and then you test to see what the effect on society is if everybody follows that rule. Kant refuted utilitarianism and felt that ethicality should be judged by the rightness of something according to a different set of perspectives. And the confusing thing potentially is that this also depends on a rule which he called a maxim. You form a rule here for the intended action, and you once again ask yourself the question, what happens if everybody does this, if it's universal? But you don't test it the same way. You don't test to see what the effect is, good or bad. You test it for logicality. And the most typical example of this is asking the question or setting up the rule, it's okay to lie. And that becomes logically a conundrum because if everybody is able to lie, you can't even tell if the statement I just told you is true or false. So it sort of loops back on itself in a way that becomes logically inconsistent. A second way of interpreting what Kant developed in terms of principles is simply you don't use people. You don't do things that result in some harm to them or even a neutral action to them, but some benefit to you. And that's fairly easy to understand. Lying to people is using them, it's deceiving them for one of your own purposes. That's kind of extended in the justice and fairness framework. Treat equals as equals. In a way, you could make a connection by saying you wouldn't want to be lied to, and you don't want people to lie to you. The person you're speaking with is an equal to you, and you wouldn't treat yourself in that way, getting lied to, so you shouldn't lie to somebody else. Of course, it extends farther than that in terms of the provision of benefits in societies and the distribution of harms or ills. This was given its most recent formulation in 1971 by John Rawls. Now, here's an important thing to understand. The social contract actually trumps all of these in terms of your initial determination of ethicality if what's at question is an action that's the law. That is, if society has passed a law saying something is to be done, then it makes it ethical according to the social contract. The social contract evolved also in the Enlightenment when the whole idea of divine right of kings and religion was being questioned. And if divine right wasn't the basis for the king being in charge, what was? This answered that question by saying people, that is, the people who live within a country receive benefits from the country being organized in some way with a government. Therefore, they owe the government allegiance to the laws that are passed. But it doesn't end there, and that's the important thing to understand for your ethical determinations. Let's take something such as that first one, harvesting organs from executed prisoners, and let's assume for the moment that it has become law. That makes it ethical. Now, if it's not a law, of course, the social contract doesn't apply. But let's assume it is a law. But let's assume you don't think it's correct. Well, that means you need to rely on one or more of these other ethical frameworks to substantiate and refute the legality of it. Let me give you an example, because this happens, it happens actually, and it's happened in America in very big ways sometimes. Back in 1896, the idea of having separate schools in the South for blacks and whites was challenged. And the court determined that, yes, it was okay to have separate but equal facilities for the races. That really was not the way many people felt the issue should have been decided, but it became the law. And for 50 years following, in the South, there were segregated schools. Blacks went to one school, whites to another. Presumably, the schools were equal. In fact, they weren't. The black schools received much less funding and were in much poorer shape and staffed more poorly. That was challenged based on these other ethical frameworks in 1954, and the Supreme Court ruled that no, it was not ethical. It was not constitutional, and that law was abolished. It was overturned. In that case, what happened was the law became, and the social contract became, that school integration was necessary, that it was necessary to overcome the kinds of segregation that developed even from factors like where people lived, that the schools had to have a mixture of races in them. And of course, this created a whole lot of other kinds of issues like school busing and various things, an attempt to correct this ill that had been perpetrated on society by really an unjust decision in 1896. So you see, these frameworks don't remain silent just because there's a law and the social contract says that the action is ethical. So in your ethical determinations, you have to determine on their own what each of these ethical frameworks say. And then you have to determine if it's a law or not. And if it's not a law, then you don't have to regard it as being ethical according to the social contract. If it's just a proposal, for example, you have to realize that if it does become a law, it becomes ethical with this framework. But until it becomes a law, the social contract really doesn't have anything to say about it. And in connection with these, you have to judge them in the ways that they indicate they should be judged. That is, act utilitarianism, pretty much the greatest good for the greatest number. A little tough to figure out who's benefiting and who's being harmed. Even tougher to find out how to measure that and then compare it. Rule utilitarianism, you must form the rule. You can't interpret this to say a rule is a pre-existing law. Then you're mixing the social contract with this. That's a naive understanding of the word rule, and it means you really didn't read well enough about rule utilitarianism. And in fact, that happened in some of the initial essays. So you make up the rule and you test it to see if the overall effect on society is benefit or loss. And to some degree, that results in quantification of various things that may be hard to measure. The same rule might be used as a maxim in this Kant and the rights approach, but you test it for logicality, not the benefit or negativity it introduces in society, although that might be in your mind. And you also judge it to see if it's using people. Now, let's just talk specifics. In terms of harvesting organs from executed prisoners, is it using people? Well, first of all, the question is a corpse a person? Normally, a lot of obligations that apply to live people don't apply to dead people. That is, usually debts die with the person. And so, does the person's rights to have control of their body extend to after their death? Well, that's a question that perhaps could be argued one way or the other, and your own religion might enter into your determination of that. On the other hand, think about this in a more powerful way. Is China using people when it picks out somebody to be executed specifically because they have organs that somebody else wants? If that's the reason the person is being executed, definitely the person is being used. However, if the person is being executed because they themselves committed what's known as a capital offense, that is an offense like murder, willfully killing somebody, which is punishable in many states by death, then if the person is going to be executed for that reason, is harvesting their organs after a humane death, using them? Some people might say it is. Some people might say, no, it really isn't, because we didn't kill them for that purpose. It's just that we're attempting to gain something useful out of their existence that might otherwise go to waste. You might even try and justify it on the basis that at least we're resurrecting some good out of the ill that this person perpetrated during their lifetime. in terms of justice and fairness, let's also take a look at the issue of harvesting organs from executed prisoners. Are we treating them equally? Well, who is the them? If we say we're going to murder anybody to get organs, no, that certainly wouldn't be treating people as equals, because the people benefiting from the organs would be, in fact, benefiting, and the people dying to give up those organs would certainly be losing something. However, that means that you've cast your net too large. We're not talking about the population in general. We're talking about a small subset of the population that has stepped outside the bounds of what we regard as legitimate activity and killed somebody. So if we say, are we treating all capital offense prisoners equally by harvesting their organs once they're killed, fairness may seem to apply because they've set themselves apart to be different from the other people in society. Now, you might also raise the issue that if this is going to be a federal law, then it better trump state laws that prevent capital punishment. And this in itself expands the argument beyond the scope of what this analysis is intended to be. In fact, one or more students actually tried to use this assignment as a soapbox to rail against capital punishment. Interesting, you can make ethical arguments either way. This is not the place to make those arguments, however. The analysis here talks about what the analysis is based on, which is harvesting organs from executed prisoners. Prisoners executed lawfully in wherever executions are permitted as a punishment for capital offenses. Now, if this became law, I wrote into the assignment that it will trump state law. That means capital punishment becomes the law across the United States. And in fact, if you wanted to pursue that issue, justice and fairness isn't being served at the present time because capital punishment is not permitted in some states and is permitted in others. A wide divergence there. The question could easily be asked, why in the United States is that the case, that prisoners are treated differently across states? Is this one country, or is this a collection of 50 little countries that cooperate sometimes and squabble at other times? Well, that's, as I say, a question way beyond the scope of this analysis. If you want to analyze that and make arguments about it, feel free, but don't turn them in here, because it's not a part of the assignment and it will not qualify for a proper response to the assignment. That's as good an explanation I can give you as the way these ethical frameworks interrelate. I hope that helps you in forming up your reconciliation of these. The main point to remember is it's not good enough in your reconciliation, that is your summation of the outcomes, simply to say something like this. Well, 3 of the 5 outcomes say this is ethical, so 3 is greater than 2, and that means it's ethical, period. That doesn't work. That's so simple-minded that you haven't done your work as a staff person making a recommendation to the task force that asked you to do this. What you have to do is to come up with some reconciliation that determines, first of all, if it's not law, the social contract doesn't apply, and then which of these is the most appropriate way to judge this particular action. And I've purposely written the cases in such a way that they will, among the 3 of them, appeal to different frameworks. And so you're going to have to think about that. And that framework that you then judge to be the most important is probably the one that's going to have the preeminent position in terms of determining if it's fair or not. However, in that case, the other frameworks may have recommendations they make to make something more humane. And I can think of something in connection with harvesting organs that you're going to have to think about yourself. And I gave you the Chinese example and the articles on that just as a backdrop. So it's to help you think about some of these suggestions or adjustments or constraints and safeguards that you do have to identify and write up in describing them in item 23 in your write-up that you turn in for the responses to each of these 3 assignments. So think about that. It's not just that you say, it's ethical or not, period, that's it. No. That's not what we're looking for in terms of your recommendation. You're going to have to explore this further, and you're going to have to determine which framework really applies to the instance, and what do the other frameworks say about it that might modify or in some way adjust the action to eliminate some of the objections that those other frameworks might have to the action. And that, if you accomplish it, will be doing a competent job on these ethical analyses. If you have any questions, please contact me. Text me, call me. I'll be happy to answer your questions. If you have any trouble downloading those documents and using them, please let me know, and I'll try and arrange some other way for you to get the use of those documents.